Curator of Academic Programs at the Belkin Art Gallery, and I'm delighted we can all be here together for today's symposium, Practices of Resistance. I'd like to begin this afternoon's proceedings by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm an uninvited guest here and deeply appreciate the privilege of living and working on this land. Our current exhibition, Hexsa'a, To Be Here Always, which is open late tonight until 7 if you'd like to visit again. There's seats up front for those of you coming in. Hexsa'a brings together new works by Indigenous artists whose work addresses threats posed by Canadian colonial capitalism to their land, water, and ecologies. Our panel today will address struggles for Indigenous sovereignty and strategies for art practiced as part of the resistance against settler colonialism and ecological destruction. All of the speakers will speak from their own experiences as artists, activists, and researchers whose practices are inextricably linked to the political and cultural life of their communities. This symposium is organized in dialogue with another program, Critical Nationalisms and Counterpublics, a conference addressing the necessity and status of the nation as a category of belonging, the perils of new nationalisms, and the promise of the counterpublics that have arisen in response to rightward turns in political governance. My thanks to my colleague Dina Al-Qasim for this wonderful opportunity to collaborate. Critical Nationalisms and Counterpublics takes place tomorrow on Saturday at SFU Harper Center. Before I introduce our symposium respondent this afternoon, Cheyenne Turians, I'd like to thank today's presenters, Teresa Montoya, Marianne Nicholson, and Tanya Willard, for joining us. Thank you for coming and being here today. It is a pleasure and a deep honor to have you all here, artist, curator, scholar, activists whose work pushes us to think and to feel beyond our comfort and decidedly more deeply than we might have otherwise. I'd also like to express my deep gratitude to Althea Thalberger. You have been a tireless advocate of the larger concerns of Hexsa'a, a generous innovator of the exhibition, and a decisive interlocutor and thoughtful colleague, and I thank you very much. I'll now turn the floor over to Cheyenne Turians, who recently took up a new post as curator at SFU Galleries. She is, and I quote from her bio, a curator, cultural worker, and writer concerned with art's capacity to provoke otherwise possibilities. As ever, thanks so much, Cheyenne. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to our panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. To echo Shelley, as we begin this symposium, I want to take a moment to recognize the history of this place, or some of the history of this place, and acknowledge our collective presence on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, and here at UBC in particular, we are on the unceded land of the Musqueam. So when I use the term unceded, I am denoting a relationship between these Indigenous people and the Canadian state, meaning that there are no treaties between them. However, treaty is a framework that has structured contact and exchange across Indigenous communities for generations. So when I say unceded, I'm marking a relationship between the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people and many settlers that make their lives here in Vancouver as part of an ongoing colonial process. I believe that this acknowledgement is especially important as we turn to consider what artistic practice has to offer to the resistance of colonial capitalism, an economic and social form that roots itself in extraction and dispossession, or that roots itself quite literally in and on the land. How should our modes of resistance be differently inflected to account for how our presence relates to this history, the history of this place, and to each other? I'm excited to have the privilege of thinking alongside Marianne, Tanya, and Teresa today, and we are very much looking forward to being in dialogue with all of you. to consider how the practices of resistance pointed to here resonate with the modes of resistance that you fold into your daily lives. So after Marianne, Tanya, and Teresa deliver their papers, we will first try and weave some connective tissue amongst ourselves. And then we'll open the conversation to the room, and we are excited to have your perspectives be part of the symposium today. So as we begin, I'd like to offer some prompts to consider as we listen to these women share their stories with us for how we might bridge between them and to this context on unceded land in a place called Vancouver within an academic institution that hosts a gallery at its heart, in my opinion. So, what does art have to offer history that is in excess of documentation? When art works against illustration, what becomes possible for the concerns that it carries? When is it appropriate to instrumentalize art and its institutions? To what ends and how? What difference does it make when the archive houses or captures our ancestors, or when the people we encounter there are strangers? Or another way, what is it that an outsider can offer, and when should they not? What are the responsibilities of artists and institutions to what needs to get done? And importantly, where does this articulation of importance come from? I imagine that much of the conversation today will investigate how art can make us think about, reconsider, and reform our ways of being in the world. And I want to acknowledge what a privilege it is to be in a space where the transformative capacity of art is a shared belief, but to also acknowledge that this is not given. So under the auspices of this symposium, I propose we gather not only to share practices of resistance, but to propose strategies of belief. And so, Marianne, I'm going to invite you to go first, and the full bios of everyone are on the website of this symposium with all of their official enumerations and accomplishments, and I encourage you to go there and check it out. I wanted to offer maybe like more personal, brief, biographical introduction. So I want to say of Marianne Nicholson that she is an incredibly accomplished scholar, artist, and cultural worker. She is one of the principal driving forces behind the exhibition at the Belkin, where her long-standing commitment to cultural revitalization and sustainability are activated through a robust engagement with Indigenous histories and politics. She also currently has a project on display at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and her work for the citizens of this city has long provided a critical lens through which to understand that colonial settlement on Indigenous territory is the foundational, irresolvable condition of contemporary life here. And so, Marianne, over to you.
Hexsa'a, thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. If I could figure out how to get my presentation out. I wanted to talk about the project. I guess it's hard, it seems funny to call it a project. It seems like so much more than that. That the title that we ended up choosing, that Hexsa'a, I talked to my mom about it, and the translation of it, what it really meant, and it took me a while to wrap my mind around it. But really, that spatial reference of the he at the beginning of that sentence or that phrase really refers to it can refer to that which is right. And it also refers to a spatial relationship of distance. So in Kwapala, we have 3 different degrees of spatial reference when we talk about things or objects in space, and the first one is kia, which is close to oneself. The second degree of distance is you, which is somewhat away from oneself. And the third one is is this key. But it can also mean that which is right. And so I thought about it through kind of this, the lens of our language, Kwakwala, and I talked to my mother about the translation of it. And really, when we talk about that which is right, then in a philosophical way, we keep the idea of that which we think is right in our minds, away from us, ahead of us, and we look to that when we are acting and doing. And in that way, we can kind of clear our minds from the chaos that is immediately going on around us, and it helps to guide us. And so I was thinking about this Hexsa'a, what does it really mean to us, and in all the chaos that has existed around us as Tayagila'ogwa people, as Muslim Tayagila'ogwa nations, that to keep our eyes forward on the teachings that our ancestors gave us, to remember that we exist as a collective and that we value each other as people within a specific place, which is the land base that we have jurisdiction and that we steward. These were the things that were in mind in regards to the title of the exhibition. So this is an image of kingdom. So this is where I come from. This is where my community comes from. And this is the place that we refer to then when we are thinking about this direction, how we place ourselves and how we look forward to how we are to act and be in the world. It comes out of this place, and how we were taught was that our beginnings were very, very, very long ago. And so the trajectory is very, very, very long. And what a privilege it is for us in our generation to be at the foreground of that trajectory. But not just a privilege, but also a responsibility. So the way that our old people spoke to myself when I was growing up was to tell us of where we came from and how we came to be there. And so they talked about our origin and how they say at the beginning of daylight, 2 wolves came to this place. And the oldest one stayed and created the village where we currently reside. And the younger one went out and he formed his own village in a nearby inlet. But this story was very, very, very old. And it was told generation to generation to generation until finally it came to, this is how I came to hear it as a young person. And I realized there was a responsibility there then also to pass that story on to the ones who were coming behind us. And so the awareness of the straightness of this line, and the rightness of that, to feel how there was so much behind you, and yet there was also so much ahead of you, and how important it was to hold your place and to carry your responsibility in that manner, and that always you were related and contained and connected by this place, the power of this place in this landscape. So when, say, this painting was done in 1998, and I was 28 years old at the time, and many of the things that I understood were intuitive. I didn't have a fully kind of formed consciousness of everything I was doing, but I was doing things that I saw reflected around me, and I was responding to those things. And one of the major themes that could not be ignored was this conflict between the way the world seemed to understand that place and how we understood it. And even when my uncles and my family members talked about this ancient story and how there was so much depth to it in time, and how connected we were to that place and how we belonged to that place, when I was going to university, I was finding out that there was a different story that was being told that was very much the opposite of that, and how we did not truly exist there and have jurisdiction there, but that how we had been moved on to very small reserves and the rest of the land was claimed then. and was being exploited. And so, in this intuitive way, I responded to that as an artist. And I thought, what can I do that I think will recognize the teachings that I was taught? And so that's why I created this painting, to kind of in a very bold way to show that we existed there, that we continue to exist there. So this shows the origin story of our people. And moving into this project, I was really broadening my thought process, and I was thinking about, these are our old chiefs, the Migratory. They're the head chiefs of the different nations, and that we call as our collective, the Migratory. And this is a photograph that was taken of them in 1914 when they went to testify at the Economic Bride Commission. And they were testifying on behalf of our land jurisdiction, and so they were telling the same story and anchoring us in that place as having been there since time immemorial, and that we had rights and that we had title to these lands. But through that process, they were denied those claims for the most part. But I wanted to show this image because it shows the collectivity of them standing together. And that also they wear their traditional regalia, which also told the story of how they came to have jurisdiction and the rights that they have, because the regalia that they wear are the legal texts, our form of legal texts, and that they had to wear these things in front of one another in order for them to be recognized, which was the whole basis of our potlatch system. So always there was anchored in this recognition of a community base for recognition of rights and togetherness in understanding our histories. And that kind of brought us to today. So 100 years later, we were finding that the fish farms in our territory were destroying our traditional fish runs. And it was a deep concern to our people, and we fought it for 30 years. We were saying no to this, no, no, no. But all the different avenues that we attempted in order to have it shut down and not happen were not successful. And so we were feeling very much pushed to take further action. And it happened that a woman in our community named Millie Willie, and she was working for the band, and she was asked to go deliver a notice to one of the fish farms in the territory to articulate our disagreement with them being there. Anyways, it escalated, and it turned into a declaration of eviction. And so it created this spark and this process of protest down the island that we organized in response. We knew that we could not evict them, but we felt that we needed to do something along that action to support it. And so we organized all of these protests down from our home territories down to Vancouver. And so this is us protesting in Vancouver. And basically, we're trying to protect the lands that we still live in. And this was kind of part of what was happening around this project that Althea and I were discussing and engaging with and thinking about. And as it happened in my own process, I had started to feel the need to reach out and open up to other people outside of the community for help and for, I guess, support. And that was difficult for me because up to that point in time, I had been very suspicious of doing that. I was very protective of the community, and I did not want outsiders. I felt very uncertain about outsiders coming in because it felt like every time outsiders came into our community, they took away things. They did not lead, they did not come and bring things, they did not come and support us. They were taking away from us. very, very literally, like taking the land away, taking our children away. So it was hard for me to personally open up and say, I'm going to try and trust that the right people that I can work with will come and will attempt something new. And that was really the seeds of Althea and myself working together, because I felt that I felt the need to reach out. I needed to find the right person to reach out towards. And in doing that, trust that things would work out. And then we were fortunate enough that Cineworks, Jem, came along and also suggested a way for us all to work together. So we started to put this project together, and we were opening up things and saying, okay, how are we going to do this? And we decided that what we would do is, in order to help the community members who were engaging in this political activism to have a voice, we thought if we use media, we can use media so that they can express themselves in some capacity. So we thought that what we would do structurally is we would bring together, say, 5 to 6 professional artists from outside, from different communities, and we would bring them into Kinkum in a residency type form, and we would have them work with, say, 5 members of our own community in terms of developing ideas and abilities. And so this image is us. What we originally did was we met in Uluru Bay and attended a potlatch that was happening there. And that was to give everyone context for how we operate and what our systems are. And then after that potlatch, we all traveled down together with the young people from Kinkum, and at Cineworks we had workshops where they were given training in media art. So that's what we see here is some of this training going on. And then from there, we developed lots of conversations and experiences together, and we brought the professional artists into Kinkum. And so this is a shot of some of the artists that we invited in Kinkum on the river with some of the young people. So, and Nabidu, this one here, always made faces. I tried to find a picture where she wasn't making a face, but so we have Scott and Diane in the front, and we made a number of trips. Really what I wanted us to do was spend time on the land so that they would get a sense of it and bear witness to what was happening there. And so this is also a picture of us in the old big house in Kinkum. And Althea is showing Nabidu how to operate the camera, and my uncle Don is giving us a narrative of the house and its history. And then this is Jamin Lavallee and Juliana Speyer working with my mom, and they were working with the crab apples that they had gathered when they went down on the flats. So, and from which they would then compose their animation piece that they have in the gallery now. Somehow, that all came together into an exhibition, the current one that's at UBC, which is really remarkable. Because when I think back on how we got there, it was really there was so much that went into it, so much activity and time spent together working on things that went into this. So for the exhibition, the real center of that exhibition is anchored in this old sense of who is behind you. And so I wanted it to have the space to be referential to the big house and our ceremonial space. So these masks that are in the permanent collection of the Museum of Anthropology actually came from Kinkum. And you can see the photograph in the background, and that photograph is of members of the community, like my grandfather's generation, standing around posing with this great feast dish the face that you see here is actually the face on that feast dish. And so the masks were placed in the center of the gallery, more or less in the way that the fire would be in the big house, which is, in many ways, it represents the spirit of that house. And the image behind it is acting in a way like witnesses. So, And then on the opposite wall here, and it's hard to see in this image, but there's the testimonials of our chiefs at the 1914 McKenna McBride on the one side, and opposite of that wall was the contemporary testimonies of Dawdinok members or leaders who were kind of advocating for the rights, the title case and the rights cases that we ultimately put forward. So all of it was meant to be like an active bearing witness within that space. So it was anchored by this kind of this traditional notion, and I wanted it to be recognizing both our ancestors, but also how the contemporary speakers were speaking to our future. And so in the same way that I talked earlier about the title, how to see ourselves on this trajectory and to keep our eyes forward. And this is the other side of it. One of the artists that we brought on board was William Wasden, and he created this, what we call a flamilas. It's a dance screen. And in the big house, this dance screen is usually, a new one is usually created for whoever is hosting the potlatch. And they put it up at the end of the house, and it separates the area where you prepare the dancers from the ceremonial floor. In this image we see, and I'm not going to go through the entire exhibition, but I just wanted to give somewhat of an overview. Lindsay Willie's work, who was one of our younger artists, and she created this body of photographs, which are stills from her media work that she's done over the years. And she's been really engaged in documenting kind of the advocacy that we have been doing regarding our lands and trying to protect them. And then she pulled these stills from them, and on one side you see the activism that is happening, and on the other side you see the actual use of the land or being out on the land. So she wanted to say why are we protesting? What is it that we're demonstrating for? And then on the other hand, to show our engagement with that place, the relationship with that place. And then what was happening at that time while the exhibition was being developed, all of the advocacy around the fish farms had created a response from government and industry. And so there was then this moment where the efforts of the people, there managed to be that we're going to get a response. But then what happened was there was these negotiations around how it was going to be dealt with. And what ended up happening for the Dawdinok is that the Dawdinok felt they needed to step away from the negotiation table, because immediately when they went to the table, they were indicated that they needed to sign non-disclosure agreements. And for them, that was not a process that they could engage in, because they wouldn't be able to be transparent and accountable to their own people. So they stepped away from that, and they said, we will do something that is more in line with how we see the situation, and we will go to the courts. So it was after long consideration of other processes that it was decided that the most positive action that we could take for ourselves was to go to the courts. So the Dawdinok filed a title case and then followed that up with rights cases. So in the exhibition, we tried to show why. This was my hope, to explain why. Why is it that we have ended up in the courts? Why is it that this trajectory of fighting for indigenous rights and land has ended up in the courts? And the exhibition as a whole actually attempts to explain that, but to explain it in different ways, because in the past we've seen how it has been explained through the media, we've seen it explained through texts, but I wanted to try and explain it through art practice so that people could get a sense of the reality of our struggle and the fundamentals of our struggle, because in these artworks I did find, and I was really honored and amazed that our participant artists that we asked to be a part of this really were able to articulate from an incredibly poignant place why we were doing what we were doing and the spirit behind it. And this shot is the multi-channel work that Althea and I composed, that more or less kind of, through the use of this performance of the McKenna McBride by contemporary members of the community, we're able to show the real beauty in the resistance of our people for the last 100 years. There was the testimony of the chiefs from 1914, and the young people of our community, or various members of our community, re-spoke those words in a public way for our own community over the radiophone, and it was a much more powerful performance than we anticipated, and we were able to shape that into the multi-channel work, which really attempts to show how it is that we've come to this place today. And this is a very beautiful, poignant work that one of the youngest members of our group illustrated, and then the Kwatwala translation for this work was done by Jamin Lavalley. So Juliana Speyer did the illustrations, and Jamin did the Kwatwala. And it was really important to us to have the language also as a component of this exhibition, because the Kwatwala language holds so much philosophy and ideas, ways of thinking that are absolutely integral to who we are as Kwatwala people, but also that it is endangered at this moment. And so not only are we trying to keep the language alive, but we're trying to keep alive all the ideas that exist within that language, which is also one of the reasons why I started to speak in a way by framing it or looking at how the title is translated. So within this work, they took a story that had been collected by George Hunt for Franz Boas, the famous anthropologist, over 100 years ago, that spoke about the crab apples within the Kinkum inlet, and how the women would go and collect these crab apples and harvest them. And the narrative itself is spoken in a very structured way that gives you the sense of the ceremonialism around everyday actions amongst the Taureno. And it's very, very beautiful. And I love the pacing of this because it has a slow, steady pace to it, which actually really reminded me of our old people, because when I was younger, I'd get very impatient with our old people because they seemed so slow and thoughtful in anything that they were doing, but I would get very impatient with it. So, and then this is a really powerful thing that came together at the same time that the exhibition opened, and it was done deliberately, and that was the filing of one of the rights cases. So the morning of the exhibition opening, our people came down from Kinkum Inlet to file one of the rights cases, and then they had a press conference around that. And so these images that are in the library right now are of that press conference. And you can see then the continuity from a few years ago from the protest to this moment in time, kind of January 10th, when this additional action was put into place. And it was really remarkable because it really blurred the lines of what art practice was and what a gallery does and what artists do and political activism. So it was a different moment for me, certainly, in regards to having exhibited works before in different galleries, but always within a certain structure. In this case, we had really opened up the room to multiple voices, and the power of those multiple voices was far greater than I could ever have created myself independently as an artist on my own, and it was really remarkable. So I'm going to end there. I hope you guys all have a chance to see the exhibition and take it in, and perhaps even see yourself reflected space in terms of how do we move forward from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. I would like to invite Teresa to speak next. Teresa Montoya is here today from Chicago, where her artistic, cultural, and academic practices are currently rooted, although that's relatively new. Her research and media production focus on legacies of settler colonialism and environmental contamination in relationship to contemporary issues of tribal jurisdiction and sovereign action. Much of her work has been undertaken with the Navajo Nation, but part of what Teresa's work so clearly demonstrates is the way that territorial dispossession and environmental contamination are pervasive features of contemporary Indigenous life. Many of these legacies are toxic, and part of what Teresa's work does is reimagine how contemporary forms of life must reshape themselves in order to effectively address the real conditions of life today. And so, over to you.
Hello, thank you. Yapte she Tracy Montoya and she taught me Zani Mishte, Nakaidene, Bashichin, Ashine Bashiche, Abo Nakai Bashinale. I'm Lene I grew up in western Colorado. My family is in northern Arizona on the Navajo Nation. So I'm a guest here also on Musqueam territory, but I'm introducing myself according to the Fourth Lands. This is how we identify ourselves as Navajo people. So the name of this province harkens back to its colonial establishment, where hard rock mining and other infrastructures have facilitated the violent dispossession and contamination of Indigenous territories. This history connects us from the Indigenous Southwest, where my research and my homelands are centered, to the coastal Indigenous territories that we are gathered upon today. As the threat of extractive industry looms ever large for Indigenous communities across the globe, from the menaces of fracking and ongoing impacts of uranium and coal mining on the Navajo Nation, to pipeline projects here in British Columbia, the risk of violence towards land and water defenders remains an everyday reality. Recall the RCMP raid on Unistostin, did I say this correct? Toward land and water defenders who are protecting their territory from TransCanada Corporation that is planning to build a $4.7 billion coastal GasLink pipeline. The utilization of military force against Indigenous peoples for access to territory, resources, and bodies has not ceased. Briefly in this talk, I argue how environmental contamination is another form of ongoing violence against our people and our territories. Identifying the threat of contamination is often elusive, and its effects even more insidious once inside our bodies. Today I present photographs taken 1 year after the Gold Cane mine spill in order to prompt us to think about the violence of contamination and its visual representations. On August 15th, 2015, a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency subcontractor inadvertently breached a dam wall below the historic and now defunct Gold Cane mine near Silverton, Colorado. The consequent release of 3 million gallons of acid mine water eventually reached the San Juan River that flows through the Navajo Nation. Within weeks following the spill, images of mustard yellow water made national news as various agencies assembled to collect hydrological data and present assurances of normalized water levels. I argue that photographs of the water, like the very toxic disasters they portray, tend to privilege the representations as discrete discharges and events, while obscuring larger structures of patterns and contamination. I present a selection of such imagery as visual metaphors to highlight the temporal limits of apprehending toxicity and its undergirding colonial violence in historical, political, and popular imaginaries. In doing so, I argue that ongoing toxic discharges on Indigenous lands, as well as images of these disasters, makes visible a a dilemma around the presumed completion of the North American settler colonial project. In what follows, I present my own photographic process, undertaken in the aftermath of the spill, to further provoke and interrogate extraction, as well as exposure in its material and symbolic forms. Forged by glacial flows millions of years ago, the San Juan Mountains in southern Colorado remain a mystical landscape to many visitors. The lure of their skies-bound rocky spires, regionally called 14ers, a colloquial title which references their higher than 14,000 feet elevation, draws thousands of tourists annually to explore nostalgic remnants of the so-called Wild West. Silverton, with a population of 650, is the only town in the mountainous San Juan County in southwestern Colorado. Though mining operations in the region formally ended in 1991, the legacy of extraction continues to feed a tourist economy of over 100,000 annual sightseers. Thus, the entire town has since been designated as a National Historic Landmark Site. Nostalgia for an open frontier is seemingly as monumental as the surrounding landscape. Growing up in western Colorado beneath the shadow of another insidious industry, that of uranium extraction, I was familiar with the Ute name Uncompahgre. Only years later, however, would I learn its meaning or visit the places that gave it life. I learned Uncompahgre means Redwater Spring. The tallest summit in the San Juan Mountains is Uncompahgre Peak, perhaps for the once plentiful hot water springs that flow in nearby Ouray, Colorado. Like Uncompahgre, Ouray, there are dozens of places named by or for original Ute inhabitants of these territories. Such naming, however, does not depict a reverential history. The first ore brought up the granite depths of the Silverton caldera in the early 1870s effectively legitimized the violent removal of Utes from their homelands located in the San Juan Mountains. The General Mining Act of 1872 laid the framework for settler colonial land seizure. The final blow was sealed with the Bruneau Agreement of 1873, which facilitated the so-called opening of territories through a legal sleight of hand that was orchestrated with the supposed blessing of Ute nations. Processes of eviction and extraction come hand in hand. Hundreds of mining claims, including one now made to the infamous Gold King site in 1887, would be staked as settlers arrived. Following the arrival of the Denver and Rio Grande Railway to Durango in 1881, the railroad began meandering northwards towards the heart of the San Juan Mountains, eventually reaching the valley where a mining camp called Silverton would be incorporated. Along this wandering course, the narrow gauge line repeatedly traverses the Animas River, a tributary of the larger San Juan River. Unsurprisingly then, many regional locales are named for water. For example, Pa means water in Ute, and this title appears in several place names throughout the region: Yampa, Pagosa Springs, even Uncompahgre in its Redwater Spring translation. Similarly, the state name Colorado is translated from Spanish to mean a reddish color, which refers to the ancestral Rio Colorado and the traces of red silt that its waters routinely stir. Today, however, the flowing mountain waters have come to be referenced for another vivid color representing the slow violence of environmental contamination: yellow. On the morning of August 5, 2015, EPA environmental contractors working at the abandoned Gold King mine on Bonita Peak ruptured a retaining wall. A mine reinforcement project became disaster as metal-laden acidic water gushed into Cement Creek below. 3 million gallons of arsenic, lead, and other metal sulfides rushed into the mountain stream. By the afternoon, the yellow plume had reached Silverton. Curiously, the sight of mustard-colored water seemed to be a regular occurrence. An employee at the local museum would later tell me that the water had always appeared characteristically yellow, just in different degrees. As we talked, I noticed books about San Juan mining and boomtown saloons, about ghosts and local lore sitting on the gift shop shelf. She clarified further: as long as I had known, there have never been fish in the water. Always yellow, never fish. And just like that, I realized that toxic mine drainage was normalized there. This was not so for downstream communities. In the hours that followed the rupture, EPA officials scrambled to control the situation, but an official press release would not be distributed until midnight approached. This breach of time, like of the bulkhead wall, would haunt federal officials for months and now years to follow. On the next day, August 6th, news began to spread. I found out about the spill from friends on social media after the plume had entered the Animas River and reached Durango. The widely circulated photograph of 3 kayakers suspended in an orange murky suit became symbolic of a kind of relationship that locals had with the river. The so-called tan color that indexed bygone eras of mining became entangled with the present recreational activities that sustain the local economy today. But absent from this image was another set of relationships that would exceed the imagination of Western legal and regulatory structure. From further downstream, I bore witness to the spill and the lingering traces of its rupture in Dene territories. One by one, irrigation gates were shuttered for Dene communities along the San Juan River: Upper Fruitland, Nananazad, San Juan, Sadakan, Shiprock. Fields of corn, melon, and squash began to weather. Emergency tanks were delivered to offer a bit of relief. But farmers in horror quickly discovered the oily residue in the tank was the same substance extracted from the earth: oil. Their toxic reach is both everywhere and nowhere, a presence that permeates, haunts, and conceals. On a westerly course, the yellow water continued through the Navajo Nation before eventually dissipating into Lake Powell. The following week in Shiprock, New Mexico, the largest Dene farming community along the San Juan River, I attend a public information meeting about the spill. The heat lingers dry and heavy as I came upon the community auditorium. Once inside, I found a space filled with farmers, concerned citizens, journalists, and students. Everyone demands answers. Do not contaminate our farms. What is in the water? I don't want my children to be sterile. What is going to happen when we get sick? If you can't clean it up, don't say that you can, because this water is dangerous and it causes cancer. Navajo Nation officials show graphs of water contamination levels, hoping to reassure community members about this evidence for pending litigation. But these answers do little to satisfy public concerns. When will we be able to farm again? Someone yelled. No one knew at the time that the irrigation channels would remain closed for 9 months, only to reopen the following spring. There were many questions posed, but few were answered. Immediately after the news of the spill broke, state environmental organizations and universities assembled teams to sample soil and water. Soon the spill revealed as much about the present fissures in bureaucracy and jurisdiction as it did about the fragmentation of indigenous territories. Both continue to reveal the perils of private capitalist industry and state oversight that have functioned without accountability to this land, its people, and our histories. In the subsequent months, while living in the Puerco Valley of northern Arizona, where I was doing research on uranium contamination, I continued to follow the Gold King mine spill and its aftermath. Increasingly, my personal and research responsibilities converged through water. I became more involved in community education and advocacy work with the Dene group Toba Nehezil, which means water is our strength. Together, alongside researchers from the Navajo Gold King Mine Spill Exposure Project, we worked to host several community teach-ins designed to share and solicit information about the spill. In these spaces and places, I was reminded how the San Juan River is considered a male entity, while the earth is female. In the aftermath of the spill, we confronted the challenge of how to steward this balance through the violence of repeated contamination. As regional sample results, which indicated the river had returned to, quote, pre-spill conditions within weeks of the incident, were released, local anxieties were not easily assuaged. What does it mean when a baseline starts from a point of existing settler colonial contamination? In public meetings, I heard several farmers speak of their customers' hesitance when they attempted to sell them produce, that they had been able to save before the water shut off. Some said they could not even sell their kadadin, the yellow corn pollen used for ceremonial purposes. There had been spills before, like the one back in the 1960s from a Kerr-McGee uranium and vanadium processing facility that sat precariously above the southern banks of the San Juan. It closed in 1968, but the area would not be cleaned up until the Navajo Nation entered into an agreement with the Department of Energy in 1983. After the Gold King mine spill, some feared the yellow discharge was yet another uranium spill, or even something akin to the Vietnam-era herbicidal weapon known as Agent Orange. For several Shiprock area farmers who served in Vietnam, this was not an abstract concern. They spoke about the trauma of boarding schools, and later, the war. There were others who bemoaned the effluent from upstream Farmington, a town located off the reservation, or the presence of commercial agricultural runoff. There were also concerns regarding wind-carried contamination originating from the Four Corners Generation Station, the off-reservation coal-fired power plant, or from the fracking sites multiplying throughout the region. I began to ask myself, what does toxic contamination even look like? The material forms are numerous and insidious. Moreover, how could we visualize and document such toxicity? 6 months after the spill, I walk into the Shiprock Chapter House in the Navajo Nation, where a special meeting was being held to debate the potential reopening of irrigation channels that had been closed since August 2015. My friend Jay and I are late to the meeting as I spent the day on the San Juan River assisting her in a collection of coarse sediment samples for a university study. Despite the promise of chemical and hydrological data that would soon be interpreted for comparative analysis and shared with community stakeholders, today we only had muddy boots and chapped skin to show for our efforts. Located 100-odd miles downstream from the point of discharge in Silverton, the spill's impact in Shiprock felt just as potent today as it did months prior. The anticipation of the spring season brings both excitement and trepidation when melting snow means increased turbidity in the San Juan River. Unknown quantities of heavy metal-laden sediment that had since settled in the riverbed will soon be churned up once again. A literal and figurative reactivation of trauma from last season's spill. Today, the chapter house is full of residents from Shiprock and the surrounding farming communities along the San Juan River corridor. All chairs are taken so we find a place to sit on the floor against the back wall. One resident stands up and begins asking about the correlation between water clarity and contamination. He asks if the water is more likely to be contaminated when it's muddy. This is a sensible interpretation given all the discussions about turbidity and re-exposure. But then he asks, if the water is clear, then does that mean it is less likely to be contaminated? This question struck with me because it indexed a larger assumption that toxicity is necessarily comprehensible to human perception, especially the visual sensorium. In public discussions such as this irrigation meeting, the appearance of yellow became increasingly synonymous with toxic contamination, not the least because of its ongoing association with uranium yellowcake. But the dissipation of yellow water in the months that followed did not signal the absence of contamination or the anxiety of its effects. Rather, I argue that the absence of toxic contamination, or the correlation between vibrant yellow and toxicity, especially in images circulated in media, obscures the everyday violence of toxic uncertainty experienced by residents themselves, but also reimagines the limits for what even defines toxic exposure. When vibrant yellow becomes the threshold for what is locally understood as toxic, how are other ongoing, less potent discharges understood? How does yellow index an anxiety around ongoing colonial violence? What is the relationship between these? The fog moves through the valley slowly and deliberately as its velvet billows fill in the contours of cragged rock and patches of vegetation. It begins to rain as I quickly retrieve a plastic bag from my jacket pocket and secure it over my DSLR body and lens. I didn't expect the weather to be this cold on an early August morning. Then again, we were pushing 10,000 feet near the confluence of the North Fork and Cement Creek in the San Juan Mountains north of Silverton. I, along with a couple dozen other scientists, journalists, and mining industry professionals, were huddled together as our guide took us on a tour around the Gladstone water treatment plant, established to mitigate acid mine discharge from the Belkin mine spill. It was on this day, exactly 1 year prior, that occurred the largest regional mine spill in recent history. The now infamous Belkin mine spill galvanized a national debate about mining law reform and the role of federal oversight in environmental remediation. At the center of these disputes, plastered across national media headlines, were images of iconic Rocky Mountain landscapes and yellow waterways, symbolic representations of the pure and the polluted. Some were obviously photoshopped to exaggerate the hue of yellow disaster. Such imagery, digitally altered or not, were used to simultaneously advance arguments towards very different ends, either the intentional failure of federal environmental regulation or the necessity for greater federal involvement in the form of Superfund designation. This bill thus marked an imagined crossing of a threshold. However, the definition of this threshold readily shifted depending on who one asked and the relative hue of yellow. As I stood beneath the naked slope, looking upon a cascade of putrid water flowing down from beneath a peak, I raised my camera and eased the frame to focus. Now this looks toxic, I thought to myself as I depressed the shutter. Out of the hundreds of photos I captured for this project, I found myself repeatedly returning to this image. In retrospect, I contemplate how incomplete my casual assessment was, for indeed the visual medium eludes as much as it affirms veracity. From this image, I further refine my inquiry. How does the attempted visualization of toxins both intensify and diminish our capacity to even apprehend toxicity and the settler colonial violence that undergirds its manifestation? I found myself intrigued not only with the composition, but also the colors itself. Dare I say, the image appeared beautiful. In the image, the water appears to emanate from an unseen source. Rubble from prior mining operations lay haphazardly on the slope. The colors of both soil and water are alluring in their otherworldly presentation. This was not the sort of beauty that brought pleasure, but rather the image increasingly stirred in me an unsettled feeling marked by discomfort and disgust. I had experienced this sort of mixed pleasure and unease viewing other photos of toxic contamination, those by well-known environmental photographer Edward Bertinsky. In her analysis of manufactured landscapes, the 25 retrospective of landscape photography by Bertinsky, Jennifer Peoples, quote, reconceptualizes the sublime response to contaminated places, end quote, to chart how such photographs function in environmental contamination. The scale and magnitude of Bertinsky's images, often taken from such heightened perspective, that the landscapes become no longer recognizable as such. And it has the potential to naturalize or even exalt the activities of environmental extraction and destruction. Even as Bertinsky reveals in his imagery the aftermath of so-called human progress, the symbolic representation of landscape collapses the beautiful and sublime into a form of memorialization where it is not clear for whom or what the viewer is mourning. The photograph thus becomes a monument to the very extractive processes that Bertinsky supposedly chooses to document in order to spurn public action. This sort of practice of documentation to raise awareness has often been a comfortable rationale for environmental activists and anthropologists who act with the justification that if only the public knew, would certain environmental violence be diminished or halted. This is not true. The belief that such imagery might compel action is rooted within underlying understandings of what effective power lies in the object's apprehension of us viewing the image. I have a whole section on the sublime I'm going to skip here. But if anyone wants to ask about the sublime, I'll be happy to talk about it. And so the tendency to focus on discrete discharges and high-impact spill events obscures what Patrick Wolf theorizes as the enduring structure of settler colonialism. Métis scholar Zoe Todd reminds us to pay careful attention to, quote, how settler colonial states conceive of, relate to, and lay claim to land and water, and how such insights are crucial in providing us with the conceptual and practical tools to refuse and refract the state's understandings of its own doctrines and destinies. Therefore, I return to the question, how does photography of contaminated landscapes expose the limits of understanding toxicity in all its colonial manifestations? I'll go through some of these images really quickly. Because British Columbia, I think, has a very similar history to southern Colorado within the hard rock mining. I don't know if this figure is prominent here in the region. It's a Tommyknocker figure. There's a lot of Welsh lore around this figure. But you see these all over southern Colorado. There's even a brewery called Tommyknocker Brewery. This image, actually, I use as the very first page of my dissertation. Was taken in northern Arizona. Several water wells and other infrastructures have been artfully decorated just like this. There's dozens of sites just like this across the Navajo Nation because of the prevalence of water contamination stemming from uranium mining. So there's over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation, of which continue to seep and discharge into our groundwater. So a lot of activists are taking action into their own hands and painting these images to warn the public about the consumption of water, because over 50% of Navajo people still don't have running water. So a lot of them will rely on unofficial water sources. And we rely on sheep a lot, so these are livestock water wells that sheep and cattle and other animals depend on, and maybe some people also drink from these sources as well. That's not going forward. Okay, well maybe this is just a sign to stop. I'm not sure. Oh, there it is. Oh, okay. And on the last note, I just wanted to mention, as if it's not, hasn't been made clear that these are struggles that connect the indigenous Southwest, but also to Standing Rock, and this was taken in New York a few years ago as part of a collective called New York Stands with Standing Rock. So this was an action that we held in Washington Square. But I especially like the sign that was shared. And I would be remiss if I didn't have a personal plug for some of my friends who are working in these different organizations. So I'll just leave this here for now. And other ways that you can learn and support more about Indigenous resistance projects. I can't get it.
Thank you, Teresa. And we will close the formal presentation part of this afternoon with Tanya Willard. Tanya is also an accomplished scholar, artist, and cultural worker whose curatorial work has been paradigm shifting for the institutions and audiences that it has engaged. And I'm thinking here specifically of Beat Nation, art, hip hop, and Aboriginal culture, which traveled across Canada. As much as I'm thinking of Bush Gallery, which is a, quote, conceptual and experimental Indigenous-led land-based artist residency, end quote, which is located in the interior of BC. So these projects, as just a small sample of Tanya's work, share and exemplify her ongoing concern for how gallery systems and art media might be transfigured, translated, and transformed by Indigenous knowledge, traditions, aesthetics, performance, and land use systems. And so when you're ready, Tanya, over to you.
Ready? I've got a picture for you, everyone. I'll stand up. I want to assume where preview is here.
Hello everyone, my name is Tayagila'ogwa. I come from the Secwepemc Nation. I live up near Chase, BC in the community of the Sconlith Indian Reserve. And I have a good heart today to be here in Musqueam land. It has a lexical suffix that indicates it's not my land, and so I do place myself here as an uninvited guest. And I think through a lot of my career and my time in Vancouver, I occupied that space of navigating as an Indigenous person in the urban area, the space of always knowing I was uninvited and that there was a whole kind of history of the colonization process that placed me in that position. And today, living back home and having the opportunity to visit other people's homelands in a way that decenters that colonization narrative allows for so much possibility. So my presentation is not going to deal specifically with my work. I was very happy and honored to be included in the exhibition. But it is interrelated because my experience with the project and with Marianne's community, which I was very honored to visit, has been to think through land rights, the aesthetic of land rights, and the ways in which I have thought about that, other than activism and community work, has also been through some work in divining the archive, or using women's intuition and other suspect ways of intervening in the archive. I love that. Get over with it. Love it. So these have been ways that I've operated that have felt precarious because they are sort of they're not considered kind of the methods which are sound and practice which you might use to work in archive. But I have an artist background, and that's what I do and what I can do confidently, and it's how I approach things. And so this is a bit of self-assurance and defense of the method of artistic practice and the space as Indigenous women that we use in navigating and wayfinding our ways through these materials. And so this is a bit of a background to a specific land rights delegation that I'm going to speak about. But first I have these images for you to look at, which are just meant to sort of situate, and I'm not going to speak to the specifics of where this image comes from, but I've had a chance to work with some different museums and access different collections, or as Karen Duffick and Jordan Wilson, Jennifer Cranmer might talk about these areas of belongings of other Indigenous peoples' belongings, which is often the case that our ancestors' artworks, our belongings have been appropriated into these museums, or expropriated into these museums, and even extirpated maybe into these museums and collections. And my interest is, one, a kind of a reflection of those spaces, but also deeply I'm invested in reconnecting them. So as many works that have inspired me have done with Indigenous peoples working in collections, there's this immediate reconnection to community that happens. And it's my interest in that, in creating the circulatory system again of these belongings, of these collections, which have been sort of in stasis. And so reconnecting with them in our practices allows us to time travel a bit through that reconnection, through invigorating a circulatory system and bringing these things out of stasis. And so this particular image, as well as this one, volume 2, just sort of speak to a history, a historical way of framing these kinds of collections. And you know, we have some masking tape, some felt pen. These include these 2 volumes include like their records of collections of Indigenous materials that are all sort of penciled in as line items. And I mean, I just love looking at these 2 images. They just speak volumes. That's my volumes to me about the complicated histories that these materials and the ways in which they presented, you know, and that obviously I wasn't really ever meant to see these 2 catalogs. You know, when they were brought out, people were a little bit embarrassed of what they looked like when they presented them to me. And so it says a lot that they were never really designed for me to look at and to look at the collection in terms of being an Indigenous person. And so that's my contextualization of some of the work that I'm going to show you today, which is a kind of a investigation of this archive. I'm going to actually, I'm just going to check my order, but this is a 1916 delegation. Many people will be familiar with this image, I think. This is the Delegation of Chiefs traveling with James Tate, who's in the center of the top line of individuals here. And all of these chiefs, Kukukbi, traveled to Ottawa in 1916 following the McKenna-McBride Commission, and also just very fed up with the McKenna-McBride Commission, the lack of real political will to actually do much of anything in McKenna-McBride other than actually expropriate more land, downsize reserves. And these are people who were fighting for many years and generations for their land rights, and so McKenna-McBride was not fruitful. People didn't see anything that was actually addressing critical Indigenous issues in the province or across the country, and so they traveled to Ottawa. Now, in this particular time that they traveled, for one, it's important for us, I think, in the ways that we have an ease of travel, or some of us have an ease of travel for, visiting Ottawa, coming back out west. But this is actually quite a difficult logistic project at the time. It's a long train ride. Indigenous communities are living in abject poverty, so to get the resources, there's all these beautiful stories of different individuals and the work that they did in labor, labor fights and rights and struggles, and that helped to also fund their travels as well as community support. And even just earlier than this, a lot of work would have had to been done to allow there to be accommodations en route. So Indigenous peoples at this time weren't allowed to stay in hotels. And so that, there's active segregation in the province in terms of navigating. So these journeys are extraordinary, right? And we one, don't often know about them in terms of mainstream history, and two, we sometimes don't reflect on the kind of extraordinary ways in which individuals organized to be able to stand up for their land rights. And so in this image, James Tate acts as an interpreter with this delegation. I'm not going to speak, there's volumes written about him. I'm not really going to speak to his role. But when they're traveling in this particular delegation, they're photographed heavily by the workers at the Canadian Museum of Man, I think at the time, right? It's the Museum of Man back then in 1916. Now the Canadian Museum of History. Maybe that still has a lot of man in it, but anyway. So they're traveling here, and actually in this year's center block of Parliament burned, and so the delegation was visiting where the actual site of the Museum of Nature is today, which is where Parliament was relocated to during that fire. And so it put these individuals who are traveling on a specifically political agenda in the mix with the museum. And what sort of ensues is a lot of kind of ethnographic context for what is a specifically political delegation. And that's where I'm sort of wanting to expand upon. Some amazing recordings and work was done with a number of these individuals who were simply gracious and outstanding to share their knowledge and their heart with workers and anthropologists at the museum. But there's also this funny thing that happens, and there are anthropometric measurements and plaster casts made of each of these individuals. They're also photographed both in their suits as they're presenting themselves here and as they traveled to Ottawa, as well as in their regalia. And they're photographed in this kind of binary when they're wearing their suit. And this also has an important history, I think, with the ways that Interior Salish have been described as acculturated. So becoming like, or we have this word, becoming like the settler. which then devalues our own artistic methods and processes and cultures, as well as there being a kind of a scale back then where interior Salish people were considered below the artistic development of the coast, or this kind of calculation that placed us, in the less interested in our community's kind of side for anthropologists at the time. This is another image. This is the photograph that's used in the exhibition, though it's a crop. And this is a later image. I'm going to go back to the 1916 delegation in a moment, but this is another delegation in I get this mixed up all the time. It's either 1926 or 1929. It's also, sorry? Thank you. 6, yeah. 1926. It's actually mixed up in the archive too, so I get it confused now perennially in my mind. But this is, like I said, a cropped image of the photograph I used in the exhibition. And it talks about here who's in the delegation. It includes my great-great-uncle William Parrish. And I think it's interesting to see the ways in which they're in Kamloops and they're leaving again in 1926, again to appeal to Parliament, to appeal to the Crown, to again extend our land rights struggle, which we are doing again here today, which is important to both link that and express the frustration that this process is taking us so long. And that we can point to our to our ancestors and the work that they've done, and that the position we're in today. So, what's interesting is in this particular coverage in the Kamloops Sentinel time, the Interior Sentinel, is that there's subsequent articles that follow. Again, sorry, this one is to London. There's subsequent articles that follow that are really negative tone, that talk about sort of a failure to meet the king, and there's a real sort of bias in the reporting that would sort of paint the whole kind of process as a failure, which strategically fulfilled objectives that didn't want Indigenous peoples to be speaking about the land rights question. And of course, not long after this, in 1927, we get the real crackdown on Indigenous land rights organizing by different policies that outlawed them hiring lawyers or assembling in large groups. And this is where you get all those amazing stories from that time of organizing, where people would, appear gathered together, but if the Indian agent came, everybody would, hurriedly spread the word, and everybody would instead be reading the gospel or singing a hymn, disguising the work that they were doing in organizing. I've heard that from a number of communities, and certainly from the time of George Manuel and stories in that family of political organizing. So this is an example of the kind of headline kind of following that. So, will Indians fail again? Is the Kamloops Sentinel headline for that. And again, that just talks about this. The fact is they have no official status, and they have not even sought interviews with the Dominion of Provincial Departments in London. Undoubtedly, they did not get any authorization from the Canadian Department. It is felt in Canadian quarters here that the Indians at home should be shown the futility and lack of wisdom in financing such expeditions from tribal funds unless the delegations receive the approval of the Canadian authorities. It's the comedy tragedy of it, right? Like, who's going to give us authority to go tell the Crown that they've stolen our land? I think we're still fighting with this unruly position where we're meant to have the permission of authorities to outline our case, and it's an impossible position. I'm going to switch to the second set. And I'm just going to allow you to look at this image. So everyone you saw in the 1916 delegation were were plaster cast and photographed by museum staff at the time. I think, heavily including Sapir and Tay. Now, just to be clear with folks, the individuals, the Kukukbi, the chiefs in these photographs, my photographs, but in terms of also their sort of likeness captured in this plaster, they of course would have consented to this process. And so they would have agreed. It's an uncomfortable and sort of long procedure to have, a kind of a release applied and then the plaster and, all this whole process, usually straws or something up the nose so you can breathe while you're having this done. So these become very sort of curious and loaded kind of items for me, archives, likenesses. And there are also ones that that this particular collection wasn't interested in me making public. The images, the photographic images of the 1916 delegation are fairly well known, but I'd certainly be curious for people who are here, who are in the, who are in the profession, who recognize that image, to know whether they know these casts exist. And it's only through a kind of meandering process of interest and intuition and being compelled for reasons I didn't necessarily know at the time that I came across this set of casts. I'd been researching a parallel set of casts made of Tecumseh, of Kamloops Secwepemc people in 1897 that are housed at the American Museum of Natural History. And it was, none of these are available in online databases or anything, so I had come across a thesis that mentioned some that were held at the Canadian Museum of History. And it turns out they didn't have the set that I was looking at from 1897, but they wrote that they had this other set, and I thought, well, okay, I'm going to go see what they are. This is an interesting opportunity. After going through the whole gamut of procedures at the museum in Ottawa, I was able to access these, as well as some others that I'll show later that link really strongly the Jesup North Pacific Expedition casts, as well as these 1916, although they're separated by a number of years, almost 20 years. And I was surprised at these ones. One, the time frame, 1916, physical anthropology and their link to sort of racial eugenics and things. I mean, there's not a lot of this happening in 1916 at this time. The other thing that's really important to consider is that, this is a specifically political land rights delegation. And so for me, I came to look at these casts in a way as this kind of rested struggle and they also look really like they're sleeping, right? Because they're cast with their eyes closed. And so there's this period of time where land rights struggle, or Indigenous struggle, especially from 1927 onward, is absolutely gone underground primarily, and I feel like in reading these casts and thinking about them, this is Chief Basil David, recognizable. I look at them as these containers, as these places of awakening. And I'm interested in bringing the knowledge of these casts and what they sort of represent to me into a wider discourse. And yet, the museum, or in this case, maybe it's also the kind of ways in which my research takes the form of artistic kind of inquiry, which is, can be uncomfortable for these kinds of collections. But that's essentially really problematic because the sitters for these casts agreed to this process, and for me, it's kind of a coded, as Leanne Simpson might call a coded disruption, or an affirmative refusal, perhaps, Jared Martineau, of the struggle and the land rights agenda that they had. And so, for me, it's a way of reading through and finding this land rights aesthetic, which for me is fundamentally also about how we might look at interrelated territories and interrelated governance and indigenous struggle in this province and certainly across this country. The other, there's all these funny things that happen when you're in these kinds of spaces, right? And the other thing that kind of spoke to me was that a number of these accession numbers, they were using capital letters, I believe, instead of lowercase letters, which actually associated them then with ancestral remains or with human remains. And so there were these other, just very kind of programmatic and bureaucratic senses of a sort of confusion between the two. I should point out here, I don't have permission from these families, these individuals, to necessarily show these images. And that's what, in my work at the museum, there's caution around. But I would say that the requirement for that permission should actually be initiated by the institution. I'm an individual artist of limited means. At least I was an individual artist at this time. I have a paycheck now, thanks to some other gigs. But anyway, that feels good, right? That working artist is precarious. We realizing this, that's true. Anyway. And so, I don't have that permission, but I also can't make that what this is about. And this is the risk taking, I guess, that is sometimes uncomfortable in institutions, is that I know that protocol, and I have shared these with some people, for example, in my language class. Elders have seen these images. I have worked to relocate names with these individuals, which I was going to bring up. I might have to wait a moment to do. But they're all the individuals in that 1916 delegation. And anytime you see that photograph of that 1916 delegation, all the individuals are named there. This is Chief Turbasket. And in this case, these casts are also quite extraordinary. So the parallel set of casts I looked at is this family?
No,
okay, sorry, you look shocked, and I was like, so it's gonna, yeah. Well, what's interesting about this cast is they've cast his braids. And you can tell this because the cast has hairs in it from where the braids are. And as an artistic kind of inquiry, I'm really interested in what that means, and I'm also still thinking about these. But my through line in thinking about them is to awaken and reflect the land rights agenda they were there for in the first place, which became much obscured by the kind of ethnographic context of this measuring of them. This is Chief William Pascal. And Chief Johnny Chilhitsa. This is a full, so the Turbasket and Chilhitsa here are full head and shoulder busts, so they were cast down to their shoulders. And then to bring some context to other artists who've worked in this way, and I don't want to cover this in detail, but I think it's interesting to look at Fiona Partington's work. She's a Maori artist. She has a beautiful publication called The Pressure of Sunlight Falling, which looks at a set of casts that were made by James Cook and those expeditions in the Pacific. And she talks about in these casts, she's a photographer, and she talks about her process of photographing these objects as embodying these moments of awakening, these moments of awakening the story, the ancestry, the spirit in some way, the connection of individuals who were cast before she photographs them. And so I reflect on sort of my process, and she doesn't have the, she talks a lot of genealogy and history for these sitters as well. But I'm sort of reflecting on the interrelated kind of projects of colonial measuring which of course, in terms of the colonial kind of measuring and anthropometric data that's being collected, so measurements, of our vanishing features, which is primarily the objective at this time, that these are, inextricably linked to the Geological Survey of Canada, to the mapping and measuring of coastlines across the world. And so these measurements, these colonial undertakings are really deeply enmeshed in these casts. And this is, so when I went to see the casts from the 1916 delegation, again, which I was under some restriction to reproduce. I'm showing them here because I think it's important. I think it's important to know they're there. I think, it would be great if we were at a place where museums could have the capacity to work with communities to understand that these kind of things are here, because it really was a complex and sort of serendipitous kind of encounter that allowed me to find these. Not that they're not cataloged, they're just not really available, and there's a kind of awkward place that they rest in the institution. Wherein many times if you're an Indigenous researcher, you're tasked with, you should have the ultimate guide to all the protocol and permissions in place, which is not expressly my job as an artist. Not that I don't, that's not about not respecting those protocols, or not understanding the need for them, but it is about, my capacity as an individual, and my sort of work here is in finding, and that's what I've done, and I'm going to share about that. And so this is another set of casts that I encountered when I looked at the 1916 delegation casts, and they're taken from a number of other communities. And where I started wanting to lead this is that I'm looking at specific ones. I was originally looking at specific casts from my community of Saqamuk people, but it's sort of, and I was expressly interested in their link to land rights because, for example, one of our chiefs, Kukbi Chief Louis, was cast in 1897, and in order to convince him to sit for the process, which, for example, I believe many in Musqueam refused the process of casting. I think Susan Roy has a few pages in her text that describe some of the casts that she looked at, but otherwise it's quite hard to find kind of much information on this kind of era and these kinds of objects. And so when I go to visit this delegation, they also bring all these out, and I was like, oh, what are these ones? And it turns out that they're a gift from the American Museum of Natural History, which were gifted in 1911 to the Canadian Museum of History. And they reflect other sitters from other Indigenous nations across mostly British Columbia, though I'm familiar with a number of collections from the prairies and from the east as well. And sorry if I didn't cover it, Chief Louis was convinced to sit for the process because he was told by Father Lejeune, interpreter, as well as young Harlan Ingersoll Smith, who were traveling also under the direction of Franz Boas. And he was told that his bust would be given to the Queen. And so for us, the Queen is, she is the she is the sort of the great mother of settlers. And it's quite significant when we're actively campaigning for our land rights that you would have a very clear line to who we at the time considered our agreements with, which is the Queen, and that can be sort of looked at through the 1910 Laurier Declaration, other land rights documents at the time. And so he was told that that cast would be given to the Queen, and that absolutely for us represented the furthering of our land rights agenda. And what happens with that cast is, and what happens with almost all of these casts, is there are no names attached to them. So because the express interest at the time is to measure their vanishing features, to kind of create an inventory and archive of Indigenous facial characteristics in quite this particular European sculptural bust tradition, right? So it's the other thing that makes them strange. And so there are these complicated objects, and they exist all across the province, and for me, they're simply a way to read through and look our ancestors in the eyes and know that they fought for the land as much as we do today, and that they're that long line behind us, and seeing them again hopefully makes us be able to see that long line ahead of us. So quickly, this is kind of a culmination of kind of some artistic method of inquiry. So my working through of particularly of Chief Louis' bust, because it was documented in Ron Ignace and Marianne's Ignace book, their new book called Biographical Introduction, so Public Land Laws and Governance. And they look at Harlan Ingersoll Smith, who was present during the castings, textual records and documents, and find that he explains in a lecture in the States how he convinced Chief Louis to sit for this process by lying to him that his bust would go to the Queen. And of course, at the American Museum of Natural History, it's inscribed Shuswap Indian. So he instead becomes, anonymous and an ethnographic subject, taking away his very important leadership and name and position. And so I had the busts from the American Museum of Natural History scanned in 3D and laser cut into this maple burl, which had sat on my land for a couple years, weathering, that a good friend pointed out to me that my dad had harvested and sort of left, because burls are really amazing things. They can't be, they're highly valuable, burls, so they're kind of a disturbance of the tissues and cells of the tree. And you can't replicate that. You can't sort of use different methods or technologies to kind of create them. They're naturally formed over a long period of time. And so my dad harvested these burls that were sitting on the land. And I liked how a friend pointed out that he, at the time, was brush cutting and saved them and brought them home. He was also thinking of them as sculptural items. He was also thinking of sculpture at the time. And so I had this CNC cut on a machine based on the 3D scans I had made of the originals in the American Museum of Natural History. And importantly, it's a bit hard to see in this image, actually, it's not too bad. Importantly, I re-ascribed his name. So, Focklach and Chief Louis. And his name had been reassociated with some of these casts. And of course, in Marianne and Ron Ignace's recent scholarship, now more work is being done to look at these objects. But when I walked into the collection, again, I had never seen them. They weren't online. I had kind of found my way through them, through also looking at the Canadian Museum of History ones, and found myself in New York, far away from home, and walking into this room, and I immediately recognized Chief Louis' bust. He's a recognizable leader, and was happy to see him. And I kind of talked about this experience and other experiences as a kind of a visiting. And I want to defend that method of working, that visiting, that intuition, those ways of knowing, those ways of finding our way amongst what can be otherwise very inhospitable kinds of spaces at times. And this is not to color different great works that are being done and excellent repatriation efforts. Ron and Marianne Ignace recently went back to the Museum of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and are in the process of repatriating some remains that were taken by Harlan Smith at this time. And I was also always interested in that connection, because these casts are being made also at an active time of collecting ancestral remains, where you see telegraph records that talk about one skull obtained and partial femurs and all this, just trade in bones, this measuring of land, all the things that that really rupture any ideas we have that things were not as traumatic as they were. And so maybe I'll end with this image with Chief Louis, because he's sort of looking ahead to that long line ahead, I think, in this image. This has been awakened, and now this process of repatriation is happening. And I'm not claiming to be an architect of that, just that awakening these items, and I know a number of you in this room know this, and you've done this work, where you awaken these collections and these things, and they enter back into circulation, they're out of stasis, and they're in this world for incredible possibility.
Thank you all so much for everything that you have shared with us this afternoon. The one thought that I'm left with after hearing all of these stories is a reflection on the bluntness with which the tactics of the state reproduce itself, especially in relationship to the dispossession of land, especially amongst the stories that you both have told about the McKenna-McBride Commission and what happened afterward. And I'm left with this question about the capacity of artistic practice to speak back to those kinds of reproductions of power, and if there is a way to think or rethink artistic practice as a mode of resistance. And going back to the stories of your community in King Come, Marianne, I'm wondering, if you can maybe speak to how the inheritance of what happened with the McKenna-McBride Commission and how this building of relationship with the ancestors in your community was essentially determined to be the exploitation of the land there. If you can talk a bit about how lessons maybe have been learned about what happened then and how your community is proceeding now with the title claims and the rights claims that are happening in the courts. But then also if you could talk a bit about how you understand your artistic practice, or the people in your community, their artistic practice, as transforming itself as a way to speak back to that power.
It would be easier with this.
Yeah.
Thanks. One of the things that really stood out going in and out of Kinkam all these years is that there was a pictograph painted at the mouth of the river, not the one that I did, but one that was painted in 1921, and that was done by my great grandfather's brothers, and they 1921 was the year that many of the Kwakwaka'wakw were incarcerated for practicing their potlatches, and so what they chose to do as a form of resistance was they bought cows from the farmer who had been granted their lands from the Canadian government, and then feasted with those cows, which was, according to Canadian law, an illegal act, and then documented it at the mouth of the river in a painting. And so we would go in and out of Kinkam and see this pictograph, this very beautiful pictograph, and ask questions about it, and then we would be told the history of this. And so it instilled within us, generations later, this understanding of resistance and activism, despite the incredible oppressiveness of what was happening to the lands and to the people at that time. And so, and I have to say, I think our people were thinking ahead, that they were seeing how to strategize in a way that would keep certain ideas alive into the future. And I have to say this, I saw that manifest itself yesterday in the testimony of Jody Wilson-Raybould, because she referred back to her grandmother, and her grandmother, Effrey, was a woman from Kinkam. And I used to see Effrey give speeches in the big house when I was younger, and she was a very powerful force. And so that flame of resistance was kept alive through generations and through different types of strategies. Often those strategies were artistically based, which for me as an artist was really inspirational, but always in combination with this keeping alive this understanding of our relationship to the land, and that we had never given it up, and that there was an incredible injustice that had happened, and we were still not willing to give that up, despite everything that had happened and gone on. And what was interesting for me looking at the busts is that in the story that is being told there, there's a political agency and reasoning behind the trip, which then is kind of transformed and reframed within a different type of structuring. And this is what I saw happening, even at the highest levels of governance, was this restructuring of purpose. And so for myself, as a community member from the same community as Jody Wilson-Raybould, witnessing her enter into a political arena where it seemed to me that whatever agency was there was being completely stifled. But then yesterday chose to completely dismiss all of the imposed structure that was placed around her in order to speak from this other position. And I never even imagined that was going to happen. So these are very, very powerful things, and they give me tremendous hope, because despite how heavily structured and imposed this colonial kind of the imprisonment of our bodies and our lands has been, we are still able to act within that and do certain things. And that's what I thought was amazing about what was ultimately done with the exhibition at the Belkin Gallery, because the space itself, in a way, addressed what had been these kind of structures and limitations around it. And our presence was actually had agency within that space. So there was a reaching, so all this trajectory of us being pushed as a people into a small space, but why could we not expand then in time into other spaces and find that center, or bring that into another space to bring that to life again there, which is in a way what you're talking about. And then when we're talking about things like the mining disasters and how the land is being destroyed, but there is also a capacity for healing to happen. And that's what is amazing to me, to see that despite everything, and despite how much sickness we see around us, or how much difficulty and oppression we see around us, there is still this seed of something that has the capacity to renew itself. And so these things that we see happening in the land still has the capacity to regenerate itself. We just have to draw attention to what is happening and keep attention on what it is we need to do.
Well, Teresa, in your talk you referenced how toxicity is not always sensible. So through this lens that Marianne has proposed of like rejuvenation or reimagining how both cultural practices and artistic practices can produce different kinds of relation. I'm wondering, in a very simple way, if you think that making toxicity sensible is a mode of resistance. You gave these two examples of that making toxicity visible has two different kinds of effects that it produces. So on the one hand, you can provoke greater involvement from the government, or making the toxicity visible becomes a way of diagnosing the failures of government. But I'm wondering if you have I don't know, stance in relationship to what that making visible does, or, you know, what does it mean to bring artistic practice to bear on these kinds of resource extraction disasters in a way that might make another kind of future possible.
Thank you. It's been really great to be here to learn and think through kind of this violence of the archive and the museum space. Because both of your projects are dealing very much with objects, but it's activated through an image, which I thought was really interesting because there's these historic photographs of these delegations, and that becomes, at least I was drawn to that as like an entry point. And I was kind of reflecting on, for me who works within the contemporary, I'm trained in anthropology, the evil discipline. That's my resistance as being an Indigenous anthropologist, to try to resist and reframe it. But you know, things like photographs that I take or work that other Indigenous anthropologists are doing now, you know, it's of this moment and how might we look back on this, or this photograph that, you know, I took, you know, a few years ago. I just was thinking kind of temporally of how your work is bridging, you know, you're looking behind and looking forward, and mine is a little bit more foreclosed. But as I was, you know, taking some of these images, you know, I have a little bit of training in photojournalism. So back in high school, I really wanted to be a photojournalist. But then as I started, you know, going to school and becoming more critical of anthropology and this history of these visualizations and extraction, and very much what both of your work shows, like how anthropologists, you know, the Western gaze, have made Indigenous people an object to be studied. So I kind of have been reluctant to take any sort of photographs of people whatsoever, because I'm so scared of kind of activating that sort of trauma again. And so I'm trying to find a balance, because there are images that I show, and it is those images of resistance, right? It's like people coming together. And I have a whole series, you know, like focusing on, there's one image of people around a hole in the ground, steaming corn overnight. So corn is, you know, sacred to us for many purposes, both for food, but for ceremonial purposes. So the steaming of this corn, I think, was really important because this was 1 year after the Belkin mine spill. So it was kind of resisting and refusing that these practices would stop because of this mine spill, even though at the same time people were well aware, well, is this contaminated? Is there some toxin that remains in this corn that we're about to ingest? Even though you have all of the reassurances from the EPA that it was fine, but it was this longer, like, trauma and fear of contamination that, of course, was ever present. So I think through a lot of my work, I volunteered with a lot of different groups on the ground, both who I would classify more as maybe like Indigenous resistance, like social movements, but also just everyday people who are coming together that don't call themselves activists or grassroots, but they just wanted clean water. And, you know, after, I didn't talk about the uranium contamination, but within that context in Arizona, you know, after we were able to get clean water delivered to the community, people were lamenting. He's like, well, we were able to come together because of this contamination, which doesn't mean that it's not justifying what has happened, but there is a way, I think, in all these spaces that Indigenous people do find a way to come together. And it was every week we would break bread together, and we would strategize, we would do whatever we could to try to find a way forward. And I think because of years and years of colonialism, like we have that capacity to endure. And so I think that the through line through all of our work is attempting to try to translate something of that violence into a space or into a photograph. So that's kind of what I thought was connecting, these conversations today. I don't think I answered your question.
Okay, but picking up on that idea of translation, Tanya, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the aesthetics of land rights today. So you have these examples of the masks that were made as one articulation that I'm not sure that would be a tactic that would be used today. So if you could maybe talk about how you understand artistic practice as in a very general way, or perhaps in relationship to your own community or your own practice, how it can learn from and transform itself in relationship to what it produces when it encounters a public. So in the early 1900s, we have these masks that are produced, they encounter a public, and they actually don't act at all the way that they were intended to. So then we go back to the drawing board, very generally, we rethink what our tactics are. What are the aesthetics of land rights in your community today, or in your practice?
Okay. I'm going to give you the definitive now canon. No. I think for me, what I'm trying to, for sure. My perspective, which comes from thinking through both my art education in a Western sense. I went to Okanagan College before it was UBC Okanagan, and then transferred down to University of Victoria. And those are useful tools, and they're part of my background. But in relocating myself back in my home territory, which I was going to comment that I've so often admired Marianne's work in her home community on that cliff face, and it was pretty exciting and moving and transformational to see it. And I think I have this way of understanding these kinds of ways things work, which we might not talk about as openly, or the ways in which transformation can be manifest. And I feel like in that work and other experiences, which I've had, certainly with learning from people in this area, both urban and local Indigenous, have led me back home. Have questioned. Led me to question myself when I'm showing work in different cities in Canada, and again, always in this position of uninvited, and hopefully the gallery makes a statement of land and territory, and hopefully the gallery brings out a Native audience in some way. And that's the time when I was doing this work, that was always limited. And I had done some curatorial residency work in Kamloops, and again, even though I'm from a community nearby, it was still hard to get people out to the gallery, and I was tired of trying to make that happen and all being the outreach for these kinds of places, and instead wanted to think about Indigenous concepts of a gallery. So certainly Indigenous arts are left out of Canadian cultural policy in the 1950s in the Massive of the West report that has its Indian arts and crafts kind of very derogatory language in that document. And so it positioned Indigenous territories very much outside of the realm of Canadian cultural kind of industry. And so I really started to question, well, what does it mean then if I'm acting within that? Yes, sure, I'm trying to change it, but for me, I grew up. We grew up in the early '80s with this song, "We Don't Need Your Constitution." It was part of Indigenous land rights, and the work of many of our uncles and aunties, and another generation of Indigenous leaders who went to talk about land rights again and again in the Constitution Express, and had this transformational journey together. And we learned this drum song growing up, which is, we don't need your Constitution, hey ho. Everybody knows this one who's here grow up in there. And so I wanted to reposition
what was devalued, or what I saw as generally devalued and not centered. I wanted to center those ways of thinking and to say, okay, Massey Levesque didn't consider Indigenous arts, and for me, in terms of Secwepemc value, a gallery is the land. So, quite simply, an aesthetics is us as part of the land, or interrelated. There's a concept, Kwasel P'tinaws, which scholar Ron Ignace and Kathleen Michelle, Secwepemc scholars, talk about as being beyond just the relations we have, familial relations and genealogy, but also including the genealogy of our interrelationship and to the natural world around us. And so, so this idea of land rights aesthetic, or I've also these theorists, Rolando Vasquez and Walter Mingolo of the Social Text Journal, they provide this contrast between decolonial aestheses and decolonial aesthetics, which is a bit wordy, but I buy into this idea of decolonial aestheses, which are about a process of kind of embodied and experiential relationships to land that are, I think, a model of, certainly my community has, since time immemorial, interrelated to the landscape around them. And for me, that defends and creates beautiful possibilities for how we consider contemporary art and land rights aesthetics that center Indigenous leadership, Indigenous land, and Indigenous knowledges, but aren't necessarily exclusive to, because I think there's many opportunities for sharing within that once our positions have been appropriately centered within that conversation. And speaking just quickly to this idea of to be here always, that's also a land rights aesthetic to say, or a land rights aestheses to say, we're here forever and ever. This is our ancestors' mitka, our ancestors' blood is here, our ancestors are buried here, and it'll be the place of our future grandchildren. And we have this saying in Secwepemc, Walnut Yaws, which means like forever and ever. And so that's what I consider a land rights aesthetic, is our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and them enjoying the land, hopefully a land that is healed from the kind of toxic place we are today. And I say that in witnessing something like the Mount Poly mine disaster in Secwepemc territory, which released an unprecedented amount of mining waste into our waterways, which again, they said quite quickly after, oh, the water is okay to drink, and it's okay, let's all forget about it. And of course, that's not how nature operates, and runoff happens, and turbidity happens, and all those toxins become part of the water column again. And there are these periods of re-exposure and re-traumatizing of the land. And, but I also think and believe very strongly in the strength of our communities. And I see that strength here with you today, and I know that carries us through as well.
I think that strategy of building and tending to the breadth of relation is something that is, again, shared throughout the stories that you have all brought here today. I think there's a number of other different tactics that are shared, like perhaps intuitive, well, at least visiting. Visiting is something that I see all of you taking up in different ways, like Marianne, the idea of bringing artists can come to work and live in the community to produce the exhibition, or even your essentially like you're going to the land, you're being in relationship to the land, Teresa, to like take these images, to bring them back, to show us, to reflect on it. And so I guess as a way of opening up to the floor, I'm wondering if people in the audience have other tactics that they would like to share about how to resist settler colonial plunder, and or if you have questions for any of us that are up here, or stories that you'd like to share.
strategy that I can identify from Teresa's presentation that maybe responds to your earlier question as well, Cheyenne. But the difference between two of your images that had signage that had the same message, this water is unsafe to drink, but one of them was a government sign and it had been translated into, I guess, another language. And then the graffiti that was on the side of the well and the sort of visual differences between them, the intended audience, the relationality of the message, the way that it's being framed, the difference between them was really striking, even though the wording is almost identical. And that the graffiti is kind of expressive, it's a sort of community solidarity gesture, and you captured this in your photographs. Like the framing that you did in your documentary work really like encapsulates that. And then the kind of clever framing of it was like the Ministry of Energy and Mines sign behind the kind of government sign as well. So just like maybe the sort of reinterpretation of the messages and the way that they're being delivered and who they're being delivered by and to, even if the content is essentially the same. It was striking.
Oh yeah, so there's this one. I wish I could have shown on the other side. I have another image, it's not here, but the text reads, like kind of in cursive that someone just spray painted, that this water has been found to be exceeding US EPA, like human health standard, drinking water standards, and that these contaminants are like not safe for livestock or human consumption, something to that effect. Which, as you said, it was very much this like public health notice. And on the other side it says To'eana, which is water is life. So this precedes Standing Rock, although that certainly was something that became very popular, because that I think kind of predates across many indigenous communities, and I'm sure you have something similar in your own languages. Let's see, where's the other image? Okay. This is wonky. There. Yeah, and then the background for any of you who are familiar with this region of the United States, that is the spire of the shiprock, for which this community is named. So I tried to intentionally frame it because that's where you are, and this is outside of a pond area, basically tailings. This is now managed by the DOE, but they put this fence around so that people wouldn't go in it. But I found this report, and actually, it's a threat to migratory birds. And this, you hear all these instances. It's like, okay, you put a fence around so humans can't get in, but animals are going to find a way to get in because, of course, they see a body of water, they're going to land, they're going to drink it. So that's what this fence is enclosing, is this this open contaminated water area. And this is actually right over the edge of the San Juan River. So this dates back to when they had a shiprock mill, a uranium mill tailings facility, processing facility in the 1960s that spilled over into the San Juan River. So when the Gold Cane mine spill happened in 2015, elders, or people of a certain generation remembered that initial spill, and they thought it was uranium all over again. So in this way, these are very different sorts of toxicants, but they kind of all collapse into one another. Like, what difference does it make when you feel this trauma all over and over again of a contamination of your waterway? And when you've heard this for so many generations, oh, the water is fine, and you remember, oh, but was it fine in the 60s? Was it fine when there was all these other spills? It causes you to question, what is actually safe? Because actually, drinking water standards are meant to accommodate industry. So, mostly looking at like uranium, health drinking water standards, you can see that what is considered to be something for public health doesn't actually align with what the drinking water standards are. So even if you're saying something is safe, it's not really safe.
so my button is asleep. I guess I want to ask you all about the place of synchronicity and of intuition, like you talked about, Tanya, and I think, Marianne, of responsiveness within the work that you're doing in relationship to resistance and our practice. Because it strikes me that this kind of method of wayfinding is often sort of characterized, Tanya, you made a joke about, feminine intuition, but is characterized as this sort of less thoughtful, less logical or rational way of going about things, but is also one that it seems to me is something that's very deeply cultivated within your practices in different ways. And even Teresa, you talking about how like the different streams of your work sort of have come together over the course of this time or project. And if you could maybe each speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm the one who definitely brought it up or characterized it. And it's a little bit of a process to becoming comfortable with sort of stating that. It is the way I work. I can talk about it in other ways that disguise or, put a more credible face on how I do that work, but it is the way I have worked to visit and wayfind and relate. And I think it's important to acknowledge the ways in which those different knowledges and awakenings can affect people and can affect the land. And it's not a sort of rational science, and I can't always explain it. But I also think like rationalism is like quite an illusion. It's a particular way of trying to organize the world around us, and the universe that extends to like the universe. And I think it has its definite set of limitations, and I think it's important to honor the ways in which that I work, and to also defend them and other people's practices. And this isn't to say like, artists are just attuned to these things and it's the way they make their work. It's about really valuing parts of that process, which are not always revealed, but are ways in which we're working. And I was explaining all these ideas and conflicts one time to a friend, Peter Moran, who might know Peter, Taltown performance artist. And Peter made me laugh because he summed it up and said, "Oh, what are you talking about? It's your ancestors talking to you." It's like, it is. It absolutely is. They, the land and our ancestors talk to us in different ways throughout our lives, whether we sort of are recognizing it or not. It's all around us, and it's important for us to listen. Intuition. That's a feminist strategy as well. So, women's intuition is often derided, and so, I'm saying, no, that's what I use. It's a good method. For me.
just kind of as an addition to that, it was interesting when we brought the artists to Kinko, because I think people's expectations may have been situated in a place where they were expecting perhaps more structure And it was difficult somewhat for me because in that position of saying, okay, how are they going to engage with the community? I felt it was better to let people be in that place and to experience the place in a much more random way. And so we didn't have a tremendous amount of structure with our residency. We traveled across the land, we spent time together, but it was very unstructured. And for some people it was very distressful that lack of structure existed. But I knew in my own mind there was a reason for that, in that I felt that I just needed to create the space, put the ingredients together, and allow whatever was going to happen for each individual. And that's where many of these works, the works from the professional artists in particular, arose from. But there was a level of discomfort because I knew that the expectation at times, that people were wondering, well, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? And I couldn't provide the answer. I could only provide the context and say, in a way, in relationship to what you just said, this place will speak to you, and these people here will speak to you. Something you need to hear. But I can't explain to you how that will happen, because that would be your own process. And it was completely intuitive. And I actually did have to resist, on some level, this kind of more rational, what you might call a more rational notion to say, well, if they're coming to your community, you need to have them, do this, and make sure everything is kind of prescribed. And so there was I thought, no, I'm not going to let that, or just, no, I have to step back, set it up and step back. And that was actually much of the process that Althea and I went through in regards to the exhibition, which it felt extraordinarily risky, but ultimately was extremely successful because in making, all we did was we made space and we provided tools, and people found their way, and so there was a letting go of a certain kind of structured requirement, that may have existed in my mind prior, which was interesting.
Okay. I'm wondering if that is related to a resistance to have art instrumentalized as political speech only. There seems the invitation that you are describing to have artists come to the community, to let the context speak to them, is a very different kind of invitation than asking people to come to make a documentary about the salmon farms, or to ask people to come and make a documentary about the ways that they are affecting the land, the community, what have you. And so, as an artist, I'm wondering if it is important for you to, is it important to insist on the agency of art outside of its political, or outside of its capacity to speak politically in this conversation about practices of resistance?
Well, that's it's interesting because we tend to think of, so when you show the slides and we show people demonstrating, then that tends to be understood as political action, whereas there were so many instances of things that happened that were political, but you didn't see the obviousness of that, such as the simplicity of going down to the flats to go and see those crabapple trees, in the acknowledgement of knowing that those lands had been taken away, and the people who had gone there for centuries prior to us had been physically removed from that space. So just to go in that space and be in that space, and that was kind of even in my own kind of ideas around art practice and art making and my relationship to objects, these things were kind of in a way being somewhat dismantled, because so much of what we were doing was being reframed and seeing it and experiencing it in a different way, where we weren't object oriented so much, and much of the like at the end of the day there was an exhibition, but it was only the level at the top there of all kinds of incredible actions and artistic. It really made me think about how, in a more contemporary context, we tend to very much focus on the space of the gallery and objects within the gallery, but all those were evidence or residual elements of a far greater thing that happened, that was far more ephemeral than the objects themselves, but the objects became markers of that.
That was another question.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I worry about the arts in Vancouver a great deal. It was only 9 short years ago with the Olympics when basically Vancouver artists and Vancouver institutions were used as lubrication for the Olympic Committee to come through. And it's unfortunate that we weren't savvy enough just 9 years ago that, the First Nations were like the major, group that was trying to stop the Olympics, stop the funding, and whatnot. And of course, like during the presentation when we saw the gold mine spill in Colorado, I'm sure half the room thought of like Gold Corp, right? And as a community, it's like the SFU Gold Corp Center, and they basically every single country that they've ever worked in the global south, they've been brought up on human rights charges. There's been indigenous people that have been murdered. There's been militaries, governments paid off. And I've witnessed so many artist talks by indigenous artists and by settler artists, colonial artists, whatever, and they've never even mentioned it. The arts community in Vancouver just kind of just pretends like that building is called something else. So I'm deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about the arts in Vancouver. And of course, the Belkin also got money from the Cultural Olympiad. UBC is littered with funding from mining companies, which are wreaking havoc. Anything you want to do with that, that'd be great. Thanks.
I'm just going to intervene and say thank you so much for bringing up these complicated set of conditions, the intersectional, overlapping political ways that we are all maybe like hypocrites and implicated in these systems of extraction, dispossession, et cetera, I feel like it's such a large concern that there's no way we're going to be able to address it at this panel. So why don't we wrap it up, have some drinks, and continue this conversation? Oh, wait.
Hi, I'm Naomi Sawat, and I work at the Belkin. We actually had a large conversation about accepting money from the Cultural Olympiad when we did our exhibition about Indian residential schools. There were a number of artists who said to us, we aren't going to participate if you guys accept money. And we did not. So not to throw shade on other people who have to have money in order to, we recognize money is sometimes it comes to us in meager bits and we try and take advantage of whenever we can, but it's something that we stuck with when we, Tammy, you were part of that exhibition. And we really wanted to abide by the artist's wishes, and that's what we did.
Thanks for offering that, Naomi, and let's all keep talking with you too after we wrap this up right now.